I am Matt Welch, editor-at-large of Reason Magazine. I'm sitting next to my colleagues, Robbie Suave, senior editor, host of the popular and non-controversial show, The Rising, done by The Hill or whoever the ownership structure there. It's very confusing.
To me as well.
He's also been recently dubbed the Baby Ryan Seacrest by John Oliver on HBO, which is very exciting. And then there's also our friend Christian Britsky, whose name I always mispronounce on purpose.
It's pretty close.
We are usually, as Reason Magazine, not this preponderantly male, just to let you know. And the only reason that I'm up here and that we are 3 for 3 dudes is because our boss, Catherine Mangue Ward, who I think is the 4th or 5th lady editor-in-chief of Reason since its founding in 1968. As you have all heard, she busted her kneecap in an unfortunate drinking accident, probably.
Scooter.
Well,
scooter and drinking, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what happened to you.
Right.
He's got pictures on his phone of his face just mangled from unfortunate scooter mishaps. But you didn't come here to listen to this. We're talking about journalism. We're talking about social media. The word clickbait was in there, so that's why Robbie is here to talk about various things. Before we start, I wanted to get a sense of the room. How many people currently are or are thinking about becoming ever in your life journalists? Okay, small, good. How many people have...
Let's see if we can get that down a little lower.
Yeah, we're going to take a vote afterwards and see if we've successfully moved the crowd. How many people have a pre-existing beef with Reason Magazine that you want to get off your chest? Very good, excellent. And how many people have run for president of the United States of America? Okay. Very good. We'll just get started and have a lot of time for AMA at the end because we know a lot of people. I want to say before even we get started, thank you to all the people who've come up and said nice words at us. It's always very invigorating to come out here and to talk to people who consume our stuff, love us or hate us or whatever, or in between, but are knowledgeable about it. It's very gratifying and fun, and we appreciate that. And we also appreciate hearing the negative stuff as well. So we'll start maybe talking with Robbie here since he is, Students for Liberty. He's the closest to a student. At least he looks like he's the closest to a student among us. I don't know. It's a tough race between the two of you.
Before the scooter accident, maybe. Yeah.
Before the scooter, the disfigurement. You grew up online, totally online, unlike me because I'm old. Maybe talk about, since the beginning of your career to now, how the rise, especially of social media and of just being too damn online, has affected journalism and your work from your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, social media has become so critical, or so crucial to what all journalists do, not just those of us at Reason Magazine. Probably in the last, from the phase 2013 about until maybe 2020, Facebook was the major source of traffic for us, for Reason.com, and that was not unique. That was also true of probably most mainstream journalistic organizations I know, and certainly most conservative or right of center or alternative, provocative, whatever you want to call them, journalistic projects. It was wholly Facebook derived. After that, Facebook was screamed at by mainstream journalists who hate the power that social media, and in particular Facebook, had over the discourse. An influence that I actually thought was positive, because if we were only allowed to talk about what the Washington Post and New York Times wants to let us talk about, this constrains conversation in all sorts of ways that are unproductive for libertarians. So in many ways, the rise of social media has, I think, been liberating for libertarians, for contrarians, for people whose views fall outside the narrow, very boring, and often very destructive mainstream consensus, which has been disastrous on foreign policy and COVID and so many other things. Social media actually has given you more license to speak. Now, the most recent phenomenon in the last 2 years, at least more, is the federal government trying to bully social media companies into restricting conversations, into restricting actual journalism. And this has prompted some disasters for us and for everyone else. So we've seen the rise, and now we're seeing kind of, I think we saw the peak a few years ago in terms of journalism being done, shared, distributed through social media. That is now changing because the federal government, in collusion with sort of mainstream voices, are trying to convince everyone that social media is too dangerous, or like you can't handle the truth, that kind of stuff. I think it's very pernicious and should actually be resisted.
The Cato Institute recently had a paper out about jawboning
Yes,
as
it's
the
fantastic.
term of art to describe the way the federal government has been saying, hey, you sure you want Alex Berenson on Twitter? Maybe you don't, kind of thing. And it's basically, transitive property of censorship. Christian, I should say about Reason Magazine, for those of you who aren't aware of it, it's a libertarian magazine founded by a mad genius college student in 1968 named Lanny Friedlander, and then run since the early 70s by a trifecta of Bob Poole, the late Tibor Machan, and Manny Klausner, now published by the Reason Foundation, which does a bunch of think tanky stuff in addition to that. But we do journalism, print magazine from the beginning. The foundation arose 20 years later and gave it sort of a stability underneath. I say all of that because I think people's conception of both journalism and opinion journalism and kind of where the journalistic discussion is these days is kind of mixed up. And some of the mix-up is from journalists themselves, increasingly those who work at places like the Washington Post. Long way of saying, Christian, can you talk a little bit about how the reporting process at a journalistic libertarian institution might differ from the normal activist or discourse process of being a libertarian online?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, when you're a journalist, ideally what you're trying to do is tell a story. And, Reason Magazine, we're not objective. We have our own perspective. We're libertarian. We're trying to get that message out into the world. But something I think is still really valuable is to make that point is to engage in that reporting process, to talk to people who are have firsthand experience, suffering under regulation or something, who can really tell that story. It's better to hear it from them than me just have an opinion and put that out there. And then it's also to kind of really highlight all the ways we like to show how big government is bad and regulation maybe fails and doesn't accomplish its ends, is to talk to the regulators, talk to legislators who are proposing these ideas, talk to people trying to shut down free activity, get some villains in your story that makes it a little bit more exciting and kind of illustrates some of the problems with government that we, that our mission is to unveil.
Robbie, talk a little bit about how your beats have evolved over time. You started writing a lot about college campus speech wars and such like. And at first, even some colleagues of yours whose names might rhyme with Fat Belch were wondering, like, are we paying too much attention to this? And then the things that you started, were documenting 10 years ago or whatever the hell you started with us, now seem to have leaked everywhere in culture, and you wrote a great book about it. Can you talk a little bit about that development and your current going theory of how those attitudes about speech on campus have proliferated into the country writ large?
Yeah, it's like the terrific writer and journalist Andrew Sullivan said, we all live on campus now. So many of the values of elite centers of education, the Ivy League, the liberal arts, the terrible liberal arts colleges, the kinds of students who even there are minority voices, who the vast majority of students do not want to censor speech, do not want to shout down speakers they don't like, that kind of thing. It's a small number of activists on campuses who are trying to stop you from hearing different voices. But they won over and over again in these battles. Craven administrations just said, well, it's easier to appease them than to be perceived as being sexist or racist or whatever their issue is. And there was kind of an idea that, well, they'll grow out of it when they go to the real world, then they get a job, they find out that you can't just scream about your oppression or something to get your way. Well, they did pretty well screaming about their oppression and getting their way in many fronts. Their values have been changing how media organizations are run in particular. Some creative storytelling organizations they've tried to make headway at in places like Netflix and HBO, et cetera. Now, I'm glad, I think we might have seen the peak of whatever you want to call it, wokeness. It's not a great term, but for lack of a better one, wokeness, causing artists to have to censor, or companies not wanting to. The company obviously wants to platform these people, but then they get screamed at by a small number of unrepresentative voices on social media or other places. They have small protests, and they say, "Oh, everybody hates this. We can't. We have to reverse course." I think maybe they're learning, at least in the private sector, they're learning that, okay, actually we should just ignore these small number of angry people that we can't make happy anyway. So I'm optimistic for the future in that the cancel culture, wokeness taking over, whatever you want to call it. In the private sector, I think we're winning that argument intellectually. But it can be stickier in lots of public sector kind of spaces, or how it's changing, government service, or the law, or et cetera, and so on, and education. So it's really spread from the campus in the 10 years since I've been covering these things, and then some of these people still have a lot of power to change the policies on social media, which is not the end-all, be-all of the world, but social media does affect how a lot of us are able to speak, and they're setting some policies, some agendas that I think are, as I said in my answer to the previous question, that are really hostile to basic, healthy principles for a free society.
Christian, one of the sub-themes of this conference, wittingly or not, is that we are in a rising, increasing populist moment globally, everywhere in the world. Not exactly everywhere, but certainly more on preponderance, both in America and abroad than, say, 10 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about your beats in the cover, the evolution of time through then, at a time when domestically Democrats are getting kind of bigger government, and Republicans are like, okay, cool, we're going to use government to attack Robbie's enemies as much as possible. Is there any good news in your beat, or is the populism infecting there as well?
Yeah, no, this is actually probably a silver lining to the general decline in politics and society. My beat is housing, zoning stuff. And what's really fun about covering this issue is that it's totally trans-ideological. So, I, as a libertarian, I like property rights. You should be able to build a skyrise on your property or whatever. But obviously that's not the case in most cities. It's very tightly regulated what you can build on your property, what you can do there. And there's this whole wide, increasingly successful movement to liberalize these rules. And it includes liberals, progressives, even people who would otherwise identify as socialists, who see restrictions on development as propping up for the socialist YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard is the term, propping up, capitalistic profits, excluding people, it's bad for the environment, what have you, to conservatives who like the property rights argument, and libertarians. But on the flip side is that you also have conservatives, libertarians, progressives opposing liberalization. I wrote a story about Redondo Beach in Los Angeles. A guy is trying to turn a power plant into a massive housing development, and he's being opposed by a Libertarian Party city council member there, whose argument is it'll make traffic worse. So I don't know. It's a fun issue to cover, but it's also one where the people who are trying to liberalize the laws, increase property rights, they're winning. They just passed a number of very important bills in California, allowing you to build duplexes anywhere in the state, allowing you to build apartments in commercial zoned areas. This is starting to get attention at the federal level, although the Biden administration, they've talked a good game, but have not really followed through on it. Yeah, so far so good. So.
Let's talk, before we open it up to questions, about kind of our perceptions of where the profession has gone, or has been going, or is going in the future. Robbie, since you're Mr. Tech Guy, you literally do a YouTube television show, which is really great, in addition to growing up online. Reason has always been, tried to be, at the forefront of as much technological innovation as possible. We got late into podcasts, frankly, but we're trying to catch up. But we did Reason TV beginning in 2006 or 2007, and I think probably still do better than most people, damn it. Oh, yeah. Getting out in front of a video, and had our first website in 1993, and these types of things. So there's always been this libertarian suspicion or belief among some, that technology is this great liberatory thing, and we want to, as an organization, participate in it. You certainly have participated in it. Yet there's a feeling now among a lot of people that, I don't know, not the internet was a mistake, but the iPhone was a mistake, or social media was a mistake. There's a lot of feeling of disquiet about what that's done to the media. What's your sense of that right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And my second book is about exactly that, trying to grapple with social media and all these calls to regulate it and all these people saying it's harmed our society. I think a lot of the things people say about social media being bad are wrong and flawed, or frankly just like bullshit. Social media has made it easier to communicate across vast distances with so many people. And social media is not just Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It's also, I'm in forums to talk about obscure video games with people who live in Finland now, because that's something that this technology has allowed. It's wonderful, and it's liberating, and it's connecting and liberating at the same time. That said, there are certainly some problems with social media. There's some social problems it's made worse. Some people who have depression or anxiety are certainly made worse by being constantly on it, just like...
Why do you keep looking at me when you're saying that?
I'm trying to look into a mirror. I'm looking at myself on the... just in that, gambling should be legal, and most people can gamble and have a good time and not, give away their wedding ring. There's a small number of people who should not gamble because they're addicts. Same thing with alcohol, same thing with everything. It's just like everything else. Moderation is good for most people, and it's fine. Now, the complaints about censorship and all that sort of stuff, I agree. There's a lot of very concerning policies being enacted. They're mostly being forced on these platforms by the government, and that's just the reality. These are not, in many cases, these are not freely chosen policies that the heads of these companies want to have. They're being screamed at by political figures and by mainstream journalists. You caused Trump to get elected because you allowed people to say this, or people are dying in the pandemic because you allowed people to say this. They're getting accused of violence and death and misery and misinformation, and actually, because they're not being defended enough on the other side by people like us, they're caving. They're caving. We're watching it happen in real time. So I think actually this is a call to action, to, as weird as this sounds, to defend these companies more, because they feel like they should have some allies on our side, and in fact they're being dictated, they're being yelled at by the government, and that's what's causing the policies we have.
Christian, I'd invite you to think a little bit, or talk a little bit about how sort of mainstream elite professional journalism has been changing a little bit. I'm thinking in particular with the rising calls for what the journalist Wesley Lowery has called for moral clarity among people, to call Trump a liar in the headline, the subhead, and the caption, and the tweet, and to sort of police adjectives. If we just adjectived harder here at the Washington Post, then we might get a different outcome. Have you seen mainstream journalism become kind of more activist over this time, or what's your view on this?
Yeah, certainly. You read, you read a Washington Post article, for instance. Trump will say something, or back in the day when he was still president, he would say something, and it was, it was off the cuff. It was kind of opinion, but then they would have to add in there like Trump claims without evidence. That it's like, well, he wasn't making like a factual claim. He was making a joke, even, right? So in some ways, that actually kind of deprives the reporting of context, because they're constantly trying to annotate, right? And also, maybe I shouldn't say this publicly, but like journalists aren't actually the sole arbiters of truth in the world. So maybe one of the worst scandals about this, I think, was probably the early reporting on the idea that COVID might have come from like a lab leak, right? Which was immediately dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Tom Cotton brought this up without evidence, and it turns out, actually, this is, it's not proven, but it's plausible. It seems like the balance of the evidence could be that it's true, Journalists didn't know that. Their job is to go out there and gather facts, not to kind of annotate in public what people are saying when they don't necessarily have all the facts themselves. And so I think that's gotten a lot worse. And the reason you have, obviously, like I said, reason we're an ideological publication, we have a perspective, everyone has a perspective. The reason that you have some guiding light of objectivity is that it disciplines you, right? It helps keep you focused, and when you remove that so you can call Trump a liar, you make it easier for journalists to give into their worst impulses, and I think that's made the profession worse overall.
Including, not verifying the thing that you're saying that he lies about. The fact-checking industry has really become a very desiccated practice of either policing the rhetoric of political candidates that has absolutely zero to do with public policy. Seriously, the lie of the year, I think it was PolitiFact in 2009, 10, something around that time, was not whatever President Barack Obama was saying about the Obamacare. It was what Sarah Palin said about it on Facebook. And it's like, one of those has power. The other one is on Facebook.
I'm seeing your PoliticoFact ranking just decline as you criticize them.
No, the fact-checking apparatus has become not a verification machine, but a preemptive ruling out machine, as in Lab Leak. I'm going to open up for questions. I just want to put in let's say, an argument for not necessarily journalism, but kind of journalistic thinking, which is to say, or consuming or behavior. And don't take that as pejorative for a second. But everybody is involved one way or the other in the fact gathering and fact dissemination business. Everyone is, especially if you have any kind of social media presence or communicating with people online. And that is a difficult process at all times. George Orwell famously said, to see what's in front of one's nose, it requires a constant struggle. It does. It does among consumers as well. And a lot of media behavior is based on incentives that consumers are giving them, and it's not always the best incentives necessarily. So everyone has kind of a role in trying to weed things out and not necessarily taking on faith what people who they otherwise agree with ideologically are saying. Having a conversation with someone in this room, brilliant young podcaster who I will not name, and she was talking about reluctance maybe to join a student newspaper because she doesn't necessarily know all the answers. And I'm just thinking, my God, when I joined a student newspaper at the age of 18, 1,000 years ago, I went in there precisely because I didn't know all the answers. I thought the point of journalism was to ask questions and to sort of try to figure things out, share your math, and go from there. It is interesting that both the perception and reality of journalism has become much more like, we have the answers, we need to tell it to you good and hard until you vote the right way. This is a catastrophe, I think, for journalism, even while it's a great opportunity for people who are a little bit alternative or orthogonal to it. And I don't know what orthogonal means, but it sounds really fancy.